Hello? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is now the presentation of Sandro Geken, and he's going to talk about, he's going to give you arguments against surveillance, and this is going to be useful because I'm sure that you all have been in arguments with conservative people, and of course it's always a big problem only to say I don't like it, or of course I have something to hide. And he's going to give us real proven arguments against always stronger getting surveillance every day. Okay, please give him a warm welcome.
Yes, hello. I'm Sandro Geken. I'm a philosopher of technology at the Institute for Science and Technology Studies in Bielefeld, living here in Berlin. And I'm also researching in the context of technology and politics, ethics and technology and so on. And within this field, I'm quite concerned with surveillance. And I feel that, also as being an activist as well, I feel that the whole surveillance discussion often lacks some substantial arguments, really. I mean, most people just say, well, I don't feel so good or something like this. So I thought I'd just kind of come here and cough up some of the real, more substantial, more material arguments. I'm going to start with sketching the outset, the situation of the activists a little. I think that as we all know, strangely, we appear to have some sort of a tough stand to defend privacy these days against people. You know, the public opinion seems to be ridden by some sort of ambivalence towards this whole issue. You know, many people say like, well, I don't have anything to hide, it doesn't concern me, I'm innocent, it's not really my problem, and so on, and they only collect useless data and so forth. So, and this really appears to be a strange situation. And I believe it is due to a certain appearance of the whole problem on the surface, because if you look at it on the surface as it appears, there are some pro-arguments in favor of surveillance, which are that we have a much more effective law enforcement against terrorism, child pornography and fraud, which are truly gruesome crimes, and these people engaged in these crimes do use electronic communication, they do use the internet substantially, and they do disguise as civilians, so there appears to be some really rock-solid rational reason to actually wiretap all these sorts of communications. And that, of course, amounts to a much better protection of life and property, and then what they say is, well, of course, that only some irrelevant data really are collected, and innocent people are largely not affected. Whereas on the contra side, most of the arguments we meet are, well, there's sort of an uncozy feeling. I don't really feel so good being surveilled, although I can't really pinpoint why or how. And of course, we do witness some minor injustices in some countries far, far away, which are crappy anyway and do all this stuff all the time. So it's not really a big difference. And then we have this set of intellectual concerns regarding values, which comes from the scholarly discussions largely saying that we need the assumption of innocence in a very wholesome way, or we need to defend democratic values, and democratic values are being threatened, and so on. But of course, I mean, so that's sort of the public judgment, and I believe what the problem is with this surface appearance of the problem is that we have, on the pro side, we have some societally important, actual, practically relevant and objective pros, which are very factual, very material, very matter-of-factly. Whereas on the contra side, we have sort of shady arguments, not really sharp, and debatable, rather intellectual concerns, subjective contras, as for instance, you can always argue about values in democracy. Values have to change, societies have to adapt to changes and new threats, and then they have to change the constitutions and civil rights, which is sort of a natural process. So it appears that on the pro side we have material, objective pros, whereas on the contra side we have some debatable, subjective stuff, really much more really debatable. And sadly, what we can witness is that most activist discussion actually implicitly support that view. because what we find in most activist discussions is that either they stress, or in most cases they stress the high importance of the civil rights at stake, and they say, well, we have to regard the wholesomeness of these civil rights, and we have to watch them, and so on, and democracy is threatened, and so. Or they state their emotional discomfort, saying, well, I feel really encaged, imprisoned, I'm not really well with this. Or what is mostly being done is that activists debate particular technological measures a lot, like what is happening in particular and what are the technical details and so on and so forth, without really giving reasons why that is bad, of course, in the background. Or what we can also witness in activist discussion is an outright Orwellian dystopianism, which goes straight into the science fiction area, dystopian science fiction area, and says, well, we're all going to die within the next 5 years. And of course, these arguments sort of support the basic outset of the problem. I mean, what the activist does is that he basically states the same kinds of arguments, but only he weighs them differently. For him, they're more important for him and for her. But still, that doesn't change much from the that doesn't change much in the outset of the arguments as such. And I believe that really, if we continue to argue like this, we're sort of destined to have a lost cause to fight for, because we really have this situation that there's the avoidance of gruesome crimes and actual dangers versus irrelevant personal data, wholesomeness of values, individual discomfort, and so on. I know that's all debatable among us, but that's sort of what I believe to be a public image in a way. And I believe that the lost cause thing comes up due to a lack of materiality, because these pro-arguments are somewhat material. They have very matter-of-factly, they can say, there are really a lot of studies which say wiretapping is this and that effective, and it prevented these crimes, and we protected these many lives, and that's very basic, very material stuff to discuss, whereas that is rather, the other side is rather difficult to judge and really subjective. So, of course, that doesn't have to be like this. There are very clear-cut, very material arguments, very practically relevant, with a very factual base as well, just in as much as the pro-arguments which we witness in the public discussions. Only the problem is that many of those arguments are still very much debated in scholarly circles and not quite out into the open in the public. So I believe that they really have to be delivered to the public, and that activists have to inform themselves about these things as well, and that the press as well has to inform the public about these acute and material arguments as well, because it's quite pointless to continuously bring technical details about new surveillance measures to the public if the public doesn't understand why that is all bad. So I believe in the first place you have to tell them, and really tell them substantially, why that is all bad. And so from a rather large set of possible arguments, I chose to bring some arguments here and present them today, some of the rather material contras. I'll just give you a brief overview now of what I will be talking about for the next 20 minutes. The first set of arguments which I will present will be concerned with psychological consequences emerging from surveillance. Namely, things which we will witness are a loss of the senses for autonomy, for freedom, authenticity, and individuality. And this is, of course, you have to be aware of that, to speak in a very factual manner of these things, as these are really the psychological material base of the values we're discussing. So when we're discussing these issues as psychological material things, we're not discussing the values, but rather the material presence of these values in ourselves. So that is a bit different from the value discussion. And another thing which we can witness also is the emergence of a monoculture of values and a loss of some respective abilities following in the wake of the loss of these senses which we have, which are namely the abilities to decide autonomously and freely and to judge ethically. And then, of course, we can ask ourselves if surveillance really becomes a societal phenomenon insofar as it is really being established as a substructure in all information and communication technology, which concerns really the larger public, then we can ask ourselves what happens to a society in which these psychological consequences are no longer just individual, but really happening on a large scale where really everybody is affected. And then what will emerge will be a rigid, norm-bound, and unflexible society. And of course, there's something to say on that. So that is the first set of consequences, which I will largely focus on because I believe it to be very material, interesting, and be very factual already now. Some other consequences which I will be stressing will be socio-economical consequences, which we can witness right now already, is the emergence, for instance, of a new and speculative class society based on profiling. And also very grave are some technopolitical consequences, namely that the surveillance infrastructure is quite apt for totalitarian regimes and can in principle not be prevented from being used in these regimes, which is a technopolitical problem from a philosophical point of view, but also with a very factual and acute base in the current stage of surveillance. And another overarching concern, which will be getting clearer in a bit, will be the owner dependence of all these consequences, namely that all these consequences are really being directed by the owner of the infrastructure. So, I start with the psychological consequences. One thing we all know from psychology is that there is it's a very annoying problem in the theory of science as well, is that the observer's effect. You know, if you're being observed, you behave and you think differently, you act differently, and also already on a subconscious level, whether you want to or not, you act more towards what the observer wants, towards what you think the observer wants, or if you're a rebellious nature, you act more against what the observer wants. But either way, whether you act towards or against what the observer wants, you're not yourself anymore in the full meaning of the word. You're really more acting along the framework of someone else. And that, of course, is a very basic, very well-known effect. And we also know by now that this effect also takes place even if you only feel that you're under surveillance, whether that is true or not. And now, the connection to technological surveillance, of course, is quite easily made. Namely, surveillance is a constant observer. I mean, this is really, this will be the case when once surveillance really becomes a constant substructure of information and communication technology, because when surveillance is ubiquitous and it is even able to hypothesize what you're thinking by profiling and scoring and all these things, then what we really have is sort of a technological constant observer in the substructures of our technological lives. And that, of course, is a grave problem. And here I just had this picture of George Orwell's from the movie 1984, the guy who's the big brother who's watching you, because it's such an ingenious picture of as well as really a person's face who is watching you all the time to symbolize this. And the results immediately emerging from this constant observer presence is that there is a generalized psychological preference towards conformity, towards controlling yourself, and towards controlling others. And now we can look at some impressions, at some basic senses we have when this really becomes a commonplace, a constant observer. And one thing is autonomy. If you regard autonomy not just as a value, but also as having some sort of material condensate, some material structure, then that material structure is most easily found in the psychological recognition, in an impression to really have your own set of beliefs, of premises, and to be able to independently decide from it. It's something we all know and something we all cherish. And this particular impression, this psychological impression and this material thing is, of course, immediately removed once surveillance becomes a ubiquitous substructure, because then, of